Okay. So I call this, and you'll see why soon, life and its equal parts. Before we immediately jump into our first topic, childhood, I want us to have a bit of an introduction to the topic. So I'd like you to look at these 5 metaphors and tell me, if any, which captures your perception of life. Maybe none of them will, and maybe you'll have in your head something entirely different. Life is a blank canvas. You can do whatever you want with your life. Freedom of choice. Or from that wonderful movie Forrest Gump, life is like a box of chocolates. And really what that was saying there, so much good and bad is out of our own hands. Life is a marathon, not a sprint. Think long term. It's a reminder that we can't burn ourselves out too much because there's still a long way to go, and don't ever give up. And fourthly, life is a gift. Need to cherish every moment. And 5, life is a building you build. You can imagine you building up your life one brick at a time. Every day you wake up and place more bricks on the temple you call your life. So, any speakers that want to relate to that? Any grab you? Not at all? Something else?
They all have some truth in them, but I wouldn't say that one is like all encompassing. For me personally, the one that resonates most is the idea of life as a gift. Mm-hmm. That's personally how I look on it.
But I think you're right that no one of them really captures everything. There can be said something from each of them. Yeah, Brenda?
Yeah, I was going to say much like Michael, except that I had never heard the saying life is a building you build for yourself. And I actually quite like that sense that you have the power to make things good or bad, regardless, and that you're not dependent on circumstances, and that you have responsibility for your own life. Mm-hmm. Even though I certainly accept a lot of like that, I agree with him that life is a real gift and we should cherish it. But I think beyond that, it's not just a gift it's handed us, it's a gift we have to take care of.
Uh-huh.
So, Bracha?
Yeah.
So I actually think that they're all pertinent at different times of your life. Each one has a relevance at a different stage of life, to be honest.
Good. No, we always expect you to be honest. But I think
my own opinion.
No. I think now that I'm looking at them, and that's in fact the way we're going. I didn't exactly have that in mind when I chose these, because I'm going to look to contrast this with what we see below that. But I think that's really right on. Looking at them, we might think of them more at a different stage in life. Even though I believe the last one, if you're building, you got to build from day one.
Exactly. But Bracha, the thing is that like if you look at from day one as a young child, you don't have that ability yet, or the cognitive ability to build yet. You have to be at least a teenager, right? But I mean, so you start your life as a blank canvas, and and then you end up building it a brick at a time until you die.
Okay. Yeah. So you've touched on something else that we'll talk to in a moment, Merle. Anybody else? No? And nobody, if you had to come up with a line that reflects our entire lifetime, may it be long and healthy, would you venture to share something else?
Life is like a river. It's
Yeah.
constantly flowing, and quite often there are cataracts and difficulties that we have to overcome.
I'm sorry, you're saying that very seriously. There is a humorous story told about some Hasidim on a Farbrengen on a Friday night, sitting around a big table, and the Hasid, their teacher, starts with very profound statements. Life is like a river. And the next person repeats it. And the next person, and the 49th person, and the 50th says, life is like a river. And then the 51st person looks at the rabbi and says, why is life like a river? So it's not like a river. But there are all kinds of images that have to do with life as well, that have to do with being in the water. And we will talk about the ability to swim later on. Okay, now, at what message does so much of our environment, and not just in North America, but here in Israel too, advertisements on TV, on radio, what message is conveyed to us regarding our individual timeline? They're commenting. So this man stopped me and wanted to offer me something that I guess falls into the category of anti-aging.
Okay.
That's big on commercials here. I know that it is in Toronto as well. What's something else that happens other than cosmetics, where you have the sense that the younger are preferable?
Oh, Bracha, that happens in hiring practices.
Exactly, exactly. When people are going for an interview, and what was that movie? There was a great movie, with one of the greatest actors, where he was out of a job, and then it seemed ridiculous, but he had to go to some young guy who was going to guide him how to present himself. And he told him, get your hair, dyed a certain, might have been Robert De Niro. I don't remember. Okay, it doesn't matter. But you're getting the sense that there is a veneration of youth. There is a belief that as the body's beauty fades and its capacity, the body's capacity diminishes, human life loses its value. Not everybody turns to an elder, a wise elder, but rather says, that's antiquated. Growing older in this society for many means giving up. They see it that we're giving up the qualities that make us beautiful. And hence, some philosophers, in comparing this perspective with ancient Greeks and the Olympics, they claim that the human condition is seen as tragic. Now, I want you to look at the second text, which is from our sages in Pirkei Avot. Look at it very carefully. At age 5, one studies Bible. Merle said earlier that not until 13 can you really expect a child, I think, to be thinking morally. Now, thinking, that might be right. And I didn't want to get into details of the Kohlberg gradations, but there's a difference between thinking and already putting some ideas into a young child, and not by a frontal class, but what he or she experiences at home. So it was felt that 5 was the age that you could already start teaching a child to read and hear the stories of the Torah. And we won't go into now which sefer they would begin with. There are a variety of suggestions and whys. But age 5 is the time to begin. At 10, the Mishnah. At 13, one is responsible for the mitzvot. At 15, one studies Talmud. You ready for this? At 18, one is ready for marriage.
Oh, boy.
At 20, one begins a career. At 30, one is at the height of one's powers. At 40, one achieves understanding, binah. At 50, one is prepared to give wise counsel, eitzah. At 60, one is given the deference of seniority. At 70, one is considered a sage and receives free bus rides. And 80 is the age of heroic strength. Now, how is this so different from what I just described via the Western view on aging?
Well, there's
Now,
respect.
you might not agree. You might, be in shock, and certainly the times have changed. So you might not agree with 18 being the age for marriage, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not the essence here. What do you see as being the essence? What the rabbis built here? Bev?
It's respect for aging, no matter, as you grow older, it seems that you're getting stronger and have more wisdom and more ability. I love that one about the heroic strength at the age of 80. And again, if we keep exercising, we can keep our strength up.
Okay, and then it actually, sometimes there are different versions, slightly different. Because I did notice another one that also talks about 90 and 100. But there's certainly a sense here that each stage of life has its own value, its own virtue, its own beauty. And in each stage of life, we gain something. It's not that we should say, I'm 50 now. What does that expression mean? I'm over the hill. What does it mean? That there's nothing more for me to learn, to grow? If I want to think about it, if I want to say how much under or above 50 I've learned, there's learning, there's love, creativity, wisdom, and heroic strength. This text asserts that we continue to grow throughout our lives. Anybody want to comment about anything in that?
Anyone who's ever been a teacher knows that learning is a lifelong activity. Teachers we're notorious for when we retire, we want to continue to learn. We've learned our whole life and we never stop.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I think also other professions who have their conferences and professional development should also be doing that, but then not necessarily all the time in their field. But I think certain professions, doctors have to do that. We should always feel there's more to learn. I took a course many years ago as part of my MA from Hebrew U, but I took a couple of courses at OISI. And I had a teacher who I enjoyed listening to. And there were probably around 12 students in the class, all adults. And at one point, one of them, and as if he was speaking on behalf of all of us, suggested to the teacher that he perhaps talks too much. And the students would prefer having the opportunity to talk. Now, you see, I run an interactive class. He wasn't perhaps doing it as much, but there was something about it that I found very embarrassing. And I felt to myself, as long as I'm a student, I'm willing to learn from others, because I prefer listening to him, who was the expert, than somebody who just wants to hear himself. Not everybody who speaks in a class just wants to, but I saw that. And unfortunately, when I took another class with him the next semester, I found that he had listened to that criticism. Anyway, but life, sure. And there's so much to learn. So one more comment about life stages. Rabbi Edward Feinstein, that I had met a few years ago, he's from the States, but he was here on a Hartman seminar that I participated in. And he says the following: Abraham Heschel once asked why it was that we are commanded to make no images of God, when God himself contradicts the commandment and makes human beings in his image. And Heschel answered, it isn't that God hasn't an image. God has an image. And there is only one material on earth from which one can fashion that image, the entirety of a human life. Not stone, not steel, but from the entirety of a human life can we fashion an image of God. And I would venture to say, it's not as simple as throughout our life, we have to live as if we're in the image of God, but probably these qualities that we saw in Pirkei Avot are also qualities that God has experienced. He grew, he made changes in his priorities, etc., etc. But we definitely, in looking at stages of our life, want to see particular phases, but I wanted us to just have a bit of a sense that they are all connected. Okay. So let's begin with childhood. If we only could. Okay. Children, what makes them so vital? Before we read this, anybody, if you had to quickly say, what is it that's admirable about a child? Because if you think about it, why did God create us with this first stage, childhood? Why not go right into adulthood? Anybody want to try to think of why it is rather important that we do begin at that point? If we think about characteristics that we think define childhood, is there something that children have that we adults don't have? Is there something that, if you had the opportunity, you miss?
Bracha, I would
Go
say
ahead.
that sense of wonder,
Yefeh, okay?
that everything in the world is new, and we lose that. We forget that the world can be an awesome place.
Yeah. Now, I agree. But I think that some sitting here would say that they're hoping that they haven't lost that sense of wonder, but I don't think it's as overriding. We maybe have a moment, we're listening to a great piece, or seeing the sunlight. And it's that a child also sees something that for us, we take for granted. You know, they'll see smoke coming out of a chimney. And that's no longer marvelous to us, but they'll comment about that. Yes, their sense of wonder. Anything else?
There's also an innocence about children, where they are open to everything, and they can enjoy the smallest thing in life. That, I mean, they can sit with a blade of grass for 10 or 15 minutes and just do something with it.
Yes, absolutely. Anybody else? Gloria?
I think also that a child is like a sponge. And whatever they come across at whatever point in time, it is, they seem somehow to take it in, and that awakens their curiosity. Why this, why that?
Curious. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Shirley Ann, with all of your children, tell us one thing.
It's amazing that you can have a lot of children and that they're all so different in so many.
Definitely. We're going to get to that.
Yeah.
And from the same parents.
Right.
Yep.
Or even cousins, the same grandparents. Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to say something too. It's Frida.
That's Frida.
I think there are some people who for the first time stop thinking about themselves and now suddenly put their life on stop and give it over to somebody else, and it opens their eyes to another world. And you stop thinking about yourself and you put yourself in the eyes of somebody else.
Absolutely. You want somebody else to bring you out of yourself, that you want to care for beyond just taking care of yourself. And the second point you made, absolutely, seeing things differently because of how your loved one sees things that you might not have seen before. Absolutely. Okay, thank you. So Janusz Korczak, someone I've mentioned previously, an incredible human being who was both an educator, a pediatrician, a poet. He took care, I forget the exact number, maybe Bev, you remember, he opened up an orphanage during the war and saved, as long as he could, the lives of these Jewish orphans. They were then told to get on a train. He was given the option of not having to go, but he did, and they all lost their lives. So he wrote several books, and one of them is called Loving Every Child. Now, one of his biggest principles was, children are not the people of tomorrow, but are people of today. They have a right to be taken seriously and to be treated with tenderness and respect. They should be allowed to grow into whoever they were meant to be. The unknown person inside each of them is our hope for the future. When we say children should be seen and not heard, you have all your life ahead of you, wait till you grow up, the child is thinking, I am nothing. Only grown-ups are worth something. I am getting a bit older though. How many more years to wait? But just you wait till I grow up. In other words, childhood is not just a stage to be passed through. On its own, it is valuable for the child. And my first thought is for the child that at least for a few years in one's life, it should be, I think Marlene said, innocent and not have to look at all the grays in life, et cetera, et cetera. But it also makes them, from what we've just said, teachers of adults. Very often, not very often, but sometimes in a class, and a student would be sharing a thought, and I'd write down something on a little pad. They were sure that I was writing down that somebody else was disturbing. And I said to them, no, I'm writing down something that Debbie just said because I want to remember that the next time I teach this. Constantly learning, constantly learning. So, Janusz Kurczak, as I said, an amazing educator and human being. Now, Jonathan Sachs, Zechrono Bracha, in talking about Parshat Bo in Sefer Shmot, he echoes Kurczak, just how critically important the child is. As Moshe, I'm sorry, do you hear that static?
Yeah.
Daniel, can something be done about that? I don't. I don't know if it's because of somebody's computer. Please, if every, could be on mute, just
It's
try it
river.
out.
It's the river flowing.
Okay, all right, I'll try. I think I could talk loud enough. So Sachs echoes Kurczak in just how essential a child is. As Moshe is about to inflict the 10th of the 10 plagues in Egypt and is preparing Bnei Israel, the Israelites, for freedom, Moshe does not talk about liberty, about breaking the chains of slavery, or even the journey in the desert that they'll be going on, or even what should be exciting news, the promised land. Rather, what does he talk about? And notice there is a theme what's going on? Are you hearing me?
Yes.
We can hear you, Bracha.
Do you still see the sources?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, because I'm not seeing you anymore.
Oh, really? It's
Yeah.
just a static.
All right, I'm going to proceed even if you're not seeing me and I'm not seeing you. Okay,
Seeing you and we're hearing you.
okay. So I don't see you though. I'm not sure why. So notice what he does talk about. Look at these psukim. And it will come to pass if your children say to you, what is this service to you? You shall say, it is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, for he passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians and he saved our houses. And the people kneeled and prostrated themselves. So you have that in Shmot. I'm not sure. Okay, we're back. You have that in Shmot?
Sorry, I can't help you with HomeKit here.
What? Chapter 12. And now, just shortly after, a second time, he talks about children. And you shall tell your son on that day, saying, because of this, the Lord did this for me when I went out of Egypt. And then in the same chapter, a third time, and it will come to pass, if your son asks you in the future, saying, what is this? You shall say to him, with a mighty hand did the Lord take us out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. He's not talking about the slavery, about Canaan or the promised land. He's focusing on children. Now, why is that? Well, Sachs says the following. He doesn't speak, Moshe, about tomorrow, but about the distant future. He does not celebrate the moment of liberation. Instead, he wants to ensure that it will form part of the people's memory until the end of time. He wants each generation to pass on the story to the next. He wants Jewish parents to become educators and Jewish children to become guardians of the past for the sake of the future. Inspired by God, Moses taught the Israelites the lesson arrived at via a different route by the Chinese. I'm sure you're familiar with this. If you plan for a year, plant rice. If you plan for a decade, plant a tree. If you plan for a century, educate a child. So the child is given an incredibly important role. And notice how he goes about it. That, picture the questions at the Seder. And it's not just the Manishtana, but they are meant to ask over and over again every strange thing that they see at the table. And as they listen to the story, ask questions. And that's good. Even the question of the contrary son. But there's something else that happens here also. And Jewish psychologists have been getting together and talking about, particularly a Dr. Miller, about the psychology of needing to feel you're part of a narrative, and that this app helps with one's own self-esteem, and more importantly, with one's identity. He goes on to say, and certainly you get this from specifically the tale in the Haggadah, but throughout the Tanakh, that is our family narrative. A family narrative connects children to something larger than themselves. It helps them make sense of how they fit into the world that existed before they were born. It gives them the starting point of an identity. That, in turn, becomes the basis of confidence. It enables children to say, this is who I am. This is the story of which I am a part. These are the people who came before me and whose descendant I am. These are the roots of which I am the stem reaching upward to the sun. Anybody want to relate to that? Do you feel that it's enough for a nuclear family to have its own narrative? Or does our incredible biblical narrative give us that much more. It certainly expands upon our own narrative. And the thing is, as it says in the Haggadah, we're not supposed to look at it as their narrative. It's meant to be mine, going way back. And it's upon the parent to tell the story in a way that the child senses that this is important to my ma and my pa. Without that, there's no point. She makes a case in her book that she has observed many children who don't grow up in narrative homes as being on the depressed side. You know, you can't make generalizations, but she's done enough to feel that she absolutely sees differences long term. Anyone else? Okay, all right. This line from the Talmud, Sanhedrin: every individual should perceive the world as having been created for his or own sake. What do you feel about this suggestion? That I say, you know what? The world was created for me. And that's a line that's suggested by the rabbis in the Talmud. How do you see that? What do you think of it? And remember, in the Talmud, there are a lot of disagreements, so you won't be disrespectful if you don't like it. Or maybe you'll end up seeing that there's a positive and a negative side.
Bracha, I think when you first look at it, it sounds very self-narcissistic. But my interpretation is, if the world has been created for me, I am responsible for it.
Right.
Ah, very good, Brenda. Okay, that is certainly the positive side. You know, like, if I have this opportunity, or if I've been given this child, it's my responsibility to do something with it. Yofi. Okay, what is the negative side? I wish that static could go away. I don't know.
You know what, Bracha, I think the negative side is exactly what Brenda said. The statement could be taken as a very narcissistic statement. And unfortunately, we have failed our kids in many ways by many of them feel that the world is created for his or her own sake without having that sense of responsibility for what the future of the world is.
Yeah. Though I would find that hard to believe, and I'm not just saying this, with the people that are sitting in this class, who I know have devoted themselves to giving values to their children. But definitely that is what can be taken from it, and many more would see it rather than the way Brenda saw it. So I'd like us to take a look at what a...
Bracha says that every individual should receive the world as if it's been created for them. So that word should indicates that there's something more that we're not reading into this.
That's interesting.
Maybe it's part of what Brenda said, but I think there must be more, but I'm not reading it either. I'm not seeing it either.
Okay, I don't know if it adds to it, but let's read on, and I think you'll see what this Yaki Tober, an educator from the Hasidic world, says. Perhaps the most striking feature of the child is his or her selfishness. relating to this comment. A child is the center of the universe. Everyone else, mother, father, teacher, friends, people, exist solely to serve him. Everything that exists and anything that happens exists and happens only insofar as it contributes to or hinders her own needs and wishes. This is one aspect of childhood from which we endeavor to mature. When we encounter a person with such a view of reality, we say of him that he never grew up. And we know people like that. And we don't mean it endearingly. This is a childness best left behind in childhood. But Tober goes on to say the following. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, which I don't often quote, however, saw the selfishness of the child as an inherently positive thing. He pointed out that the Talmud states that a person is obligated to say, for my sake, the world was created, which is the more accurate quote, really, Shirley-Ann. Maimonides, elaborating on that, writes, a person should always view himself as perfectly balanced, half good, half evil, and the entire world as balanced between good and evil. And for the entire world to the side of good and brings to himself and to them salvation and redemption. Now, this is a very difficult perspective for an adult to assimilate. A single good deed? At any given moment, there are billions of people doing billions of deeds, good and evil, pedestrian and profound. Is it anything but sheer egoism to believe that what I am going to do now will make a difference for the entire world? And yet, we do believe it. And at least, if we scratch away enough cynicism and despair from the surface of our adult souls, we reach this childish belief, which is actually the truest part of ourselves. Now, do you ever find, or did you ever find yourselves telling your child, you can do whatever you want? Not, I don't mean in the sense of, you want to do something bad, that you have the power to change the world. I think we've all done that. And I don't think we're just saying it. We want them to believe that they should at least make an effort. I think some of us have children because we believe and hope that there will be a child who will someday save us all. Huh? But Tober calls this a childish belief to think that one person can do it. But you have to reach for the stars before doing nothing.
But Bracha, we very often speak about the power of one. And
Yes.
It may not be one person will totally change the world, but if you add one and one and one and one, etc., the power of one may change the world.
Absolutely. And the other Mishnah from Pirkei Avot that we all know, Lo alecha melacha ligmor, that it's not up for us to finish something in its entirety, but we begin and somebody else will take over. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I guess the question is, though, getting back to what you said before about how many of us do succeed in giving our children a sense of responsibility, how many really take on lives where they are not just looking to earn a salary or have a very satisfying, interesting job, but think of a job where they will be able to help people. I think many that we know have done that, but there are others, because you would like to think, well, why can't all these children get together when they're at the age where they can and do something already? Do something. We're begging you. We're begging you. Okay. I would like you to tell me, we already began it when Brenda mentioned wonder and somebody else curiosity. But what are spiritual things that kids do better than adults? So Brenda said wonder. Anything else? Spiritual things. We talked about noticing something magnificent.
Children, they can believe so easily about concepts of God and things above and beyond themselves that many adults look on as childish, which is ironic because it means childish in a way that, oh, how could you believe in something like that? But
Absolutely.
you talk to a child about God and they're just in awe and they listen to every word and they have no problem accepting that.
Yeah, I was once at a table many, many years ago, and a granddaughter, I don't know that she was more than 5 or so. I'm forgetting where I was visiting, but she said something that was about God, and her mother kind of put it down. And then the grandfather later, I overheard him talking to the mother, why did you have a need to do that? You know, let her enjoy that belief or whatever. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? I think it also is the fact that they're not inhibited about asking questions. They are ready to be vulnerable. They are willing to admit their deepest fears, and that can be a way of communicating with God. They overtly show excitement. I think adults do too, but sometimes they'll do it and get carried away. And maybe they take more risks than we do. So this other educator, Steve Freeman, who happens to be from Vancouver, writes the following. Sometimes I ask myself, who is this God I'm praying to? I can't see him. I can't understand him. How can I have any relationship with him? And I answer myself with a childhood memory. As a child, I wanted a bicycle. For months, real bad. I finally got one for my birthday, which happens to be in October. But in October, in Vancouver, where I grew up, it could rain for weeks without stop. So I asked God to please make it sunny tomorrow so that I could ride my new bike, which he did, for which I was very grateful because in Vancouver, that's a miracle. And if you would have asked me then, who is this God? What makes him God? How do you know he exists? None of those questions would have had any meaning to me. All I knew was that he was listening whenever I talked to him. Whenever I talked to him, as long as I talked to him, wherever, as long as I really meant it. And that if I needed a sunny day, God was the address. This is all I can tell you about the God to whom I prayed as a child. And that is the God to whom I pray now as an adult. As Rabbi Shimshon of Chinon put it, so often quoted by the Rebbe, when I pray with the mind of a small child. Yes, then I was a child. I knew no better. Now I have a mind of my own. Now I've read books and written books, studied from teachers and argued with them, sat and contemplated again, and then contemplated my contemplations. And yes, that's the hardest part of becoming an adult, growing and learning while never leaving the child behind. Because all the philosophy and theology and Kabbalah and contemplations of all the greatest Jewish thinkers is only to achieve some sort of grasp of one thing. Who is this God to whom we prayed as a child? I think it's a beautiful thought that when somebody said earlier here that we lose something, maybe Brenda, I think I could envision a combination of tefillot that allows us to speak as a childish individual in the good sense of the word, but then as one who's addressing God, knowing all the blacks, all the whites and the grays, and the difficulties and the arguments that we want to have with him. Now, let's look just a couple of more minutes at going back to the role of the parent with this child. So Mishlei, a very prominent phrase, chanoch lana'ar, from the word chinuch, educate, al pi darko, gam ki yaskin lo yasur mimena, train a child according to his or her way. For even when he or she grows old, he or she will not turn away from it. The essence of that is not that they're not going to turn away from what you've taught, but that you have to know how to teach every child. And we said it before with Shirley Ann, you can have two kids in the same family, like Yaakov and Esau, and they've got to be treated differently. You might even have the same goal. Rivka and Yitzchak wanted those two gentlemen to be thriving members, pious members of the Jewish people, but unfortunately, through certain interpretations of certain words, which we won't go into now, it's seen, and Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, the wonderful 19th century commentator, founder of Neo-Orthodoxy, criticizes Rivka and Yitzchak for not seeing that they had to treat each of them differently, that it wasn't going to be enough to treat them the same. Listen to what Hirsch says. To try to bring up a Jacob and an Esau, and we know their personalities, in the same college, make them have the same habits and hobbies, to want to teach and educate them in the same way for some studious, sedate, meditative life is the surest way to our disaster. And it's true. Hirsch goes on to say, perhaps things could have turned out differently with Esau if they had worked with him in a different way. And this is certainly something that we can relate to in this world of differentiated teaching and differentiated learning. You know what a teacher now who teaches in such a school within one class is obligated with this differentiated learning to prepare 5 different ways of teaching something. One will learn in this way, one will learn in another way. I'll never forget, what's her name? Samara Cookie, Cookie, who died. You know what I'm talking about? What is her last name? Cookie?
Cayman.
Cookie Cayman, Allah Shalom. So one of her granddaughters, Jody's daughter, now she was a brilliant girl and very talented, but for some reason, she was given a test to do through singing. She built something up through a song. Yeah. But it's quite a pressure on a teacher of today. Now, but parents have that responsibility. And if they can't do it, at least make sure that it's happening where their child is. And maybe one child's at one school, another at another school. And then we talked about water. And Rabbi Don Moskowitz, who's also from Vancouver, says the following. A favorite teaching from the Talmud tells that a parent's responsibilities to their children understandably include teaching them a trade as well as Torah. But it also says that we must teach our children how to swim in the Talmud. Why? Well, this is a metaphor, so to speak. What is swimming? Swimming is curiosity. Swimming is navigating the rough waters of life without any support, entirely on your own. We teach children to swim so that they will know courage, know to overcome fear. For if they know how to swim, they can call upon the resources of courage that dwell within each soul, let go of fear, and venture out into the uncertain, the unknown, unaware that they can make it to the other side of any divide. They gain the confidence to do anything, particularly that which doesn't come naturally or is unfamiliar. Yeah, quite a metaphor. Just want to say before we go to our last text, getting back to removing a child from his egocentric behaviors. So at the age of 5, they are meant through the values that they begin to hear and they see in their home and through looking at the Torah. But it's not till later on that they become responsible. But certainly we are a religion that doesn't just talk about rights, but obligations. So the parent is responsible for the child, but then there comes a time that the child is obligated, according to the Talmud, and it's in the Torah as well, not in as much detail, that some of the duties of a child to the parent is you are to dress your parent. Now, what does that mean? It can either mean, God forbid, if the parent needs that help physically. It could also mean if the parent can't afford anymore to buy, so you buy. It can mean taking them on an errand or doing an errand for them. The same with food. Hopefully buying and not having to feed, but we know that happens. Then there's a different type of obligation. Anybody want to say? That doesn't deal with these concrete needs. At your dinner table, I don't know if such tables exist anymore. There's some families that would have a set seat for the parents. And I know a family here, even though the father is gone 22 years, nobody sits in that seat. You don't contradict a parent in public. These are rules. So it isn't enough to just say, let's take him away from egocentric. But my first thought right now, as I said that, is we want to find that balance. Just as that other Mishnah in Pirkei Avot says, "Ein ani li mili." If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? But then it continues. But if I'm only for myself. But I want to close the courage to parent. What would you think is the most difficult part of parenting? Or maybe I should say, not just difficult, but frightening part of parenting. And don't tell me when a kid comes home with lice. Over the years, that was the most difficult thing for me, the one time it happened. No, seriously.
I think I would say, just something that popped into my head right now is that when a
Yes.
child is hurt, is emotionally hurt, and we know as parents, just as we know for anybody, I'm thinking now also about somebody who's in, there's bereavement, that you can't take that pain away from the person. You know that they have to go through it. I think it's compounded with a child because they're just so little, and almost helpless in that. And you know that they have to go through the process. And we can only be there to support, but you can't do it instead of them.
No, and you can't deny them the opportunity to grieve.
Correct.
Hide them from that either. Absolutely. Thank you, Nechama. Anybody else?
I think there's the other part of it is being able to love your children and limit them at the same time. It's only through a certain amount of discipline in their lives that they really begin to understand that you do love them. If you let them run free, then they do not have this concept of being cared for.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You don't just not do something because it's going to upset them. Yeah. Anybody else?
I would say that it's scary to let children be independent and go out in the world on their own.
Okay. Okay. And that's a good lead in to what we'll close with. Atara Lindenbaum, a highly esteemed teacher in the Boston area. Child rearing, like gardening, breaks the illusion of control we have in this world. A farmer can tend to his fields, carefully watering and nurturing the soil as needed, but larger forces of nature will ultimately determine the farm's bounty. Similarly, parents can follow careful and prescribed methods of education, but a child will make independent, what Daniel just said, decisions as an adult. The inability to dictate exactly how children will decide, though, does not exempt a parent from investing carefully in a child's early years of education. A parent's dedication to Torah education, coupled with the acknowledgement that the long-term effects of this education is beyond his or her reach, is itself a demonstration of deep faith and courage. I think she's saying something so true, that you have maybe devoted, and I'll be quite literal, so much, not just time, but funds to helping you pass on values and messages that are not just important for you. I believe from the bottom of my heart that when we pass on values, and that is the job of a parent, that we're doing it because we think they are worthy values. But what she's saying is that's pretty courageous, knowing that come 18, 20, 12, they're going to say goodbye to that. But you can't do anything beyond that, right? So God forbid that we should have a sense, though, that the most important job in the world would stop if you were looking for certainty. And despite decisions that they'll make, you have to trust that the really important things, for the most part, they will take with them. Yes? We optimistic? Let me hear a yes, no?
We have to trust our kids. That's part of it.
This is
Trust
true
them.
also. This is true. This is true. Okay,
And we have to be understanding when they don't follow the scripts that we wrote.
And
Isn't
sometimes you
anybody
just have
else?
to, yeah, sometimes you just have to go with the flow. It's not always the way we would like it to be, but it is what it is. And, you know, that's life.
In today's
But
world,
I think that there's that sense, though, that we can't think that melchatchila to begin with and say what this is saying to us, no matter what's going to happen, take that responsibility of parenting very, very seriously. And it will be sad if what you're hoping doesn't come through, but that doesn't mean you won't love your child. Right?
I'm not sure I'd use the word sad. I think we just have to be respectful.
And in today's world, where their kids' values are so different and from our values, and with technology, it really does take a lot of patience and understanding.
Okay. So if we talked about children and needed to be understanding, just wait till next week in adolescence. Okay.
Thanks, Bracha.
Thanks, that was great. Have a good week,
Make sure you're
everyone.
drinking. And I know I'm going to make my sister very happy. It's supposed to be even warmer tomorrow. Nechama.
I can't.
Yes, sir.
I know you can't drink. All right. Have a good week.